We were home from Japan a week last fall and went to a county planning commission meeting, and here they were saying, you suppose that tourism would help us here to get some more jobs? I hadn't left Japan. It was the same thing.
Jackson H. Bailey first went to Japan in the fall of 1945, right after the end of the Pacific War. He has returned to Japan almost every year since then, and for 4 decades has been teaching East Asian history in Earlham College. For 20 years, he has directed various exchange programs that place American students in little communities in Iwate Prefecture, along the northeastern coast of Honshu Island. The history of one such community, Tanohata, is the subject of Dr. Bailey's most recent book, Ordinary People, Extraordinary Lives. Today, Dr. Bailey talks with anthropologist David W. Plath about the book and how he came to write it.
Now, you didn't go to Tanohata originally to write a book. What took you to Tanohata in the first place?
Yeah, I was just kind of fool-lucky. I was looking for a place to help our students have a work experience and to learn some language. And my friends at Waseda University gave me an introduction to a man who had begun a kind of self-help reforestation project. And so he took me out there with the possibility in mind that I might be able to make use of it.
By your students, you mean from Earlham College, from American colleges?
Right, American students. Yeah. Then we were able to work out an arrangement for them to work with Japanese students in this self-help reforestation project. And by the time we'd done that 2 or 3 years, and I'd been there every year to talk with them and go further with it, I began to realize there's something very interesting going on here. In this place that nobody knew about, and you couldn't get there from here.
500 kilometers north of Tokyo.
Right, way out there.
Over a mountain range. In fact, probably before the railroad was put through and before good roads were put through, it may have been easier to get there by boat.
Yeah, you literally couldn't get there from here except by walking. Now, by the time I went, you could go over dirt road in a Jeep type, four-wheel drive vehicle. So by 1977, we sent a person to go and live and teach in the village. And within a couple of years of that, I began to think, my goodness, this is a story that's worth telling.
Before then, you'd lived in many parts of Japan, visited many parts of Japan. So it may not have been the case, but were there any difficulties that you ran into? Well,
really not. It was one of the most wonderful years. That and our year in Kyoto. But of course, the fascinating thing was to go to Tokyo, talk to people there. We went down about once a month, and the first question always was, taihen desu ne, nakanaka fuben deshou ne.
Must be really inconvenient.
Inconvenient,
yeah.
Must be tough, living way out there. And of course, we had to tell them, no, it really isn't. It's wonderful. Best fish in the world. So the diet's good.
I run into the same kind of question whenever I come back into the cities from the Shima coast when I'm doing field work out there. And my standard answer is the only thing that's inconvenient about it is the local dialect.
Yeah.
That's tough.
Yes, it is. That's right. And older people, of course.
Yeah.
Wherever you go in Japan with older people. So, gozansu, gozaimasu. Sure, there are those things. Though it's remarkable how people will shift to standard Japanese. But sure, if you're listening in on a conversation, you often find yourself just lost.
Well, let's suppose you had to pick a souvenir, one souvenir, to put in a museum somewhere and say, this is a wonderful symbol of living in Tanohata.
That's not easy. I suppose 2 or 3. A jomon pot that was shown me by a neighbor, just out one day and invited in for a cup of tea, and here's this lovely little jomon. They'd rebuilt...
Dating...
10,000 years, I don't know, anywhere from 4 to 10,000 years. They'd rebuilt their house. And in doing the excavation for the foundation, for the new foundation, they'd turned this up. Well, to be living next door to somebody who has that, that's incredible.
It was on a site where the human habitation has been going on for at least 10,000 years.
Now, the other thing, I suppose, is it is such a beautiful place. And if you go there now, this is what people say when they go there now. the contrast or the cross-current there, because the people we talked to, that we got to know as friends, telling us the stories about how awful life was. You had to walk to get there. So the village nurse walked everywhere, and she was dentist as well. And well, the stories, yes, I'm sure they're embellished, but even so, it was tough. You just, these people went through the fires. So enough so that when the change came, when the opportunity for change came, they were ready to follow the leader.
Jack, over the last 30 years, the rising tide of economic development has lifted all boats in rural Japan. 4,000, 4,500 communities have all gotten better over the last 30 years. What's special about Tanohata?
Well, when one says that, my mind immediately jumps to the fact that it didn't get better for Tanohata. The first 10 years of that rising water, Tanohata went down, not up. And in a sense, it's very simple. Their one source of cash income was charcoal. And as the water rose, people converted from charcoal to kerosene, and so Tanohata lost its one source of cash income. So living standard went down, population went down 20% in that first decade. So Tanohata was an exception in that first phase.
But what brought them back up out of it then, 20 years?
Well, things got so bad that they couldn't go anywhere but up, and along came a young fellow who had no business yet being mayor, who was elected mayor. Well, when he first got into politics with the fishing co-op, a fishing co-op that had gone bankrupt, and so they gave it to a 25-year-old because nobody else wanted it. And then 10 years of experience with that, he was ready to take on the job of being mayor. And by the time he got to be mayor, he'd had enough experience in organizing, working with people, getting people to work together. And I guess the most important thing really was he had a vision. And he had convinced people that the vision was a valid one.
Okay, say a little bit about the vision. What was
well, if you ask him, and this is, of course, what I did over a period of some years, he would say his vision was education. You build the village through education. They were so far down that there was no way to get immediate movement, so you had to have that long-term vision to get something started. However, when he really got down to it, after he was elected mayor, the first thing they had to do, for instance, was to get telephones, because people couldn't communicate with each other. Roads and telephones. So within 5 years, he came to be known as Doro Soncho, road building mayor.
Small communities all over the world, not just in Japan, typically have pretty sharp factions. Right. The mayor must have had to overcome some factionalism.
He did. No question about it. He ran for mayor once and was soundly defeated in a group of 4 or 5 candidates. Yes, clearly there was Hamlet versus Hamlet, and particularly coast versus mountain trouble. And he would say, he told me that it took him 3 terms to overcome that. That is, it was 12 years before he dared to build a good hard surface roads directly from the village office down to his own hamlet. He had to be sure other places, and particularly up in the mountain, because he was from the coast. And this was borne out if you look at election results. That is that the mayoral elections up to his point, one person had had 2 terms. No one else had had more than 1. He's now in his 7th term.
How did you deal with questions of factionalism? I don't think you can live in any community for very long without being pulled by different factions. How did that affect your own work?
I tried to protect myself against that sort of thing by, of course, I came, in a sense, at the invitation of the mayor and of his chief troubleshooter, so that was my entree. But I then was able to develop personal contacts. My wife studied flower arrangement with an individual who had nothing to do with the village hierarchy. I went and worked with a couple of dairy farmers and got to know their families well. One of the things that interested me very much, there was an election, a local election the year I was there, and I was able to interview people, 18 people in the village council. 17 of them were Mushozoku, non-party people, so-called, but of course most of them attached to LDP factions in some way.
Liberal Democratic Party.
Liberal Democratic Party, but there was one communist member, and I had no problem at all having an interview with him.
But if are Tanohata people likely to read the book and say, you're really giving one faction's portrait of Tanohata? Is there still a group that really feels out of it? I would say that there may now be emerging such. The mayor has been in office so long that there clearly is strong criticism of him in the village now. For we never see him. Where is he? What's he doing? The other possible source of bias in my situation was partly covered by the fact that I knew people personally in the upland part, up in the mountains, and the mayor was from the coast, and so that separation I was not victimized by, if we want to put it that way, because I knew what was going on up there. Now it's clear that when things started, it was the people on the coast who were worst off. But by the time I was there living, it was the people in the mountains who were worse off because there had been coastal development for fishing. And so there was a sense, and it appears in the rhetoric, the political rhetoric, and in the economic planning, what are we going to do about these upland communities, the upland hamlets that are falling behind because they don't have sufficient source of income yet? So there's that kind of thing, but I think I was not cut off from those things. Well, it's a difficult thing to handle, even at best. Let's come back to the book itself, though. When did the idea for the book? I mean, you wanted to do a book, but when did the idea for this book begin to take shape?
In the course of my year of living there, because, of course, I was gathering data and talking to people, doing interviews, and all of that, but also trying to listen very hard to what seemed to be the agenda. And the thing that clearly emerged was this role of the mayor and of political leadership. And so I resisted that for quite a long time because charismatic leadership, that doesn't fit the Japanese political pattern. You know, people would keep asking me, but isn't it really the mayor who's the source of all this change? And I'd say, well, yes, of course, but there are a lot of other things too. But by the end of that year, and particularly as I sat down to write and to try to make some sense out of my data, that's the thing that appears over and over. His vision, his articulation of goals, his ability to bring people into his administration, all those things.
How has the book changed over the several years that you were involved in writing it? I find in my books, by the time I am ready to send it to the publisher, it's almost always radically different from the book I started out to write.
Well, the thing that happened fairly late in the game, I was wrestling continually from the time of our year there with, I wanted to be sure that I portrayed some sense of how the women of the village lived. Caroline Bailey did a lot of interviews. She spent a lot of time with the women of the village. And my original thought was, as I outlined the book, was we'll have a chapter on the women. I must put that in because so many studies don't, kind of an afterthought. And fortunately, people sort of challenged me on that and said, well, that just seems like a different thing. Why is it there? What are you doing with it? And that forced me to go back and rethink the whole thing and to weave that material back into it, bring it in along the way, and I think this helped a great deal. But
if you were to sit down and start writing the book now, would you do it any differently?
Well, with the benefit of hindsight, of course, I could start out knowing much more clearly my conclusion. I found I had a struggle for a long time where to stop, because of course nothing ever stops As a historian, one continually is faced with that problem. But it turned out that 1985 was a very good stopping point, because certain things came to closure there. They had, in particular, the two big things. 1984 was known as Kaiho no Toshi, the year of liberation for Tanohata.
From what?
Liberation from their isolation. The culmination of that whole process, because in the spring, on April 1, 1984, the railroad started running up and down the coast. For the first time, people could continue to live in Tanohata and commute to work or commute to school, to high school. That was really revolutionary. Up until then, if you wanted a job outside, you had to live outside, or if you go to school, to high school, you had to go outside. So that was monumental in itself. But then in the fall of that year, the great bridge, Shii-Ohashi, was opened.
Yeah, I've seen
spanned
pictures.
a big ravine. Yeah. And so the mayor, in all of his rhetoric of that year, and all of the publications, this is the year of liberation. So it was a culmination of processes that began in the mid-60s. And so in that sense, as I look back, I can see how that might have been a lot easier to think about if I'd said, well, here's 20 years, and it'll make a nice package. I didn't know that when I started. Yeah.
At what point along the way did you say to yourself, or did you, finally, I can start asking the right question?
In one sense, it may be the moment when I was sitting having tea one morning with what sometimes we call the local redneck, a very conservative fellow in town who owned the local gas station and was the Sakaya. He was a very prosperous fellow. And I had been combing the documents and trying to figure out what was it that had happened 20 years before when Tanohata had been under pressure to consolidate with the neighboring town. And I'd followed this, and I'd talked to people, and the document said, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. There's even a telegram saying, it's happening. Congratulations on your...
But it didn't happen.
But it didn't happen. And no more documents. And it's clear Tanohata did not, I mean, the next door town's there.
Yeah,
didn't happen.
They didn't consolidate.
So I was just getting nowhere with it. And we were just sitting talking, and I said, gee, you know, what do you suppose? What was it? Oh, he said, I'll tell you. My dad was mayor at that point, and they had the meeting that was going to celebrate the consummation of the consolidation. And he got drunk and insulted everybody in sight, broke up the meeting, and that took care of consolidation. So no wonder there are no more documents.
Yeah.
Now, so that, of course, put me on the right track. So by being there, living there, getting to know people, and getting them to in relaxed conversation, you begin to get insights that you wouldn't otherwise have.
How many times did you have to rewrite? Or did you?
Oh, yes. Oh,
I find I oftentimes tear up half what I've written and start all over again.
Oh, yes. Well, 2 major rewrites, and I suppose 3 in a sense. Yes, no doubt about it, because I didn't know what I was looking for. I was just trying to understand. Tell me more. I want to understand. Yeah. I didn't know anything about the fishing part of it. I knew something about the agricultural part of it, so I had to learn about the fishing. And then, oh yes, there's lumbering too. There's the forestry going on. So I suppose I'd say the first 5 years maybe, getting the total parameters of what is the raw material that I'm working with. I had to, one of the major things that happened was getting into this thing called Daisan Sector, third sector or hybrid company kind of thing, because there'd been very little done on it.
Right.
And yet all of a sudden I found that this was central to their whole concept of economic development and jobs. These hybrid enterprises that would somehow generate infrastructure, allow accumulation of capital, and give them a sort of launch pad from which to do things. Well, I didn't know what Daisan Sector was.
Do you now?
I think I do. Yeah, I find it fascinating. So I had to go off into economics.
In English, there must be 10 or more books, portraits of rural communities in Japan. What's different about yours? I know you've read the others.
Right. I think it's the focus on the politics of it, and the way in which the politics articulates Tanohata's life and reality at the regional level, horizontally with other towns and villages, and at the sort of prefectural and national level. Because one of the things that I learned was how well the mayor, Hayano, had learned his business of, and he's been a pioneer in getting this horizontal interaction going with other towns and villages. One of the things that makes it quite different is the evidence that it brings to bear on that question of how important is top-down decision-making in Japan.
Well, it's a marvelous case study of local action, bottom-up action, if you want to call it that. Jack, what about the future for Tanohata and the lifestyle it represents? I mean, it's come up fast, it's done well, but you were saying that the mayor has been in there now 20 years or more.
Yes, there are a lot of questions. From my perspective, the single most important question is what comes after him. It's so difficult. A man so powerful, so charismatic, is going to leave a vacuum because there's no space for the new leadership to bubble to the surface.
The roads are built, the school is built, that all seems to be running fairly well.
What's next?
What's the new set of issues?
I've had conversations with people in the village about this, and particularly some of the development people. And they will say, you know, we don't know, we're looking for the next thing. I particularly got that answer after the railroad started up, because the number of people, the traffic through the village went from about 300,000 to 1.2 million in a year.
In a year?
In 1 year.
Wow.
I mean, just an absolute, geometric jump. And he said, of course, that was a tremendous shot in the arm to us economically.
Sure.
All kinds of benefits from it. But what do we do for an encore?
Yeah.
What's next? Well, since then, they've established an ice cream factory. They make their own ice cream from the local dairy.
Sell it to people coming along the road.
So, yes. So they're capitalizing on that. But the question is, what next? Because there must be a next. There has to be a next. And they themselves are saying, we're looking. Now, another little issue that is sort of fundamental to this, they have the resort hotel, which they built. And they're now in the process of, I think it's a fourth addition to that.
To the hotel.
About every 3 or 4 years over the last 10 or 12, they've put an addition onto it. And I kept asking them, does the business justify that? The first time they said, no, it does not justify it, but it will draw more. We have to do it in order to keep the momentum. The next time they said, well, we think so. And I think this time they're saying, probably it did justify this round. But that business, they say, we're running so hard and we got to keep running because we don't know for sure what's going to be the next move that will keep the momentum going.
Jack, what's the big message you want an American reader to get from the book?
Well, the thing that came back to us as we lived there, that comes back to me over and over again is these people are human beings. They are Japanese, and so there are distinctive things about them. But I've lived and worked in the Midwestern part of the United States. I've worked on a dairy farm. I see the same kinds of human qualities, a kind of unsophisticated humanity that welcomes people, that doesn't really understand the big wider world maybe, but is quite open to learning about it. These are ordinary, everyday folks. Of course, primary economic activity, agriculture, fishing, forestry. And so they're working with their hands, they're blue collar in that category. And so their concerns are those everyday concerns. They're not intellectual concerns primarily. But it's one of the most interesting things to discover was the sort of rebirth of culture in that village. Even in the 20 years that I've been going there, I can see, well, for instance, just in the last year, they've begun an annual koto concert. Well, 20 years ago, nobody had any time to learn the koto. And the thing I heard them talking about was, at last we have enough of the necessities of life that we have the time and energy. It's both time and energy that they need.
Well, I think it's not only time and energy, I think it reflects something going on all over Japan, which is a blurring of what seemed to have been much sharper class distinctions until a generation or so ago, which was that even if you had the money and the time, if you were a farmer, you shouldn't be studying the koto.
Right.
That's
I think you're right.
for city people.
Absolutely.
That's for middle class types.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so.
Those things are really blurred, and anyone can aspire. This is not rural society anymore. It's...
No, I don't think it has been for quite some time, but the image of it as rural has lingered on long after, I think, the realities changed. Although in some important way, and we don't have a good label for it, their rhythms of life, it seems to me, are still at least partly tied to the rhythms of the crops, the rhythms of the seasons, the rhythms of the shellfish, and their reproductive cycles offshore, and so on and so forth.
That's right, and many of them have now become articulate about that in almost a philosophical way. How are we going to preserve that?
Yeah.
Because it's a vital part of our quality of life here. How can we do that and maintain the economic viability of our lives? I was just there recently on the issue of dairy farming, which has been a major source of prosperity in that village. Now milk prices are being cut, subsidies are being reduced, and they're wondering, can we continue with agriculture as a way of life?
What's next for Jack Bailey?
Well, I want to continue tracking that. I've got a lot of comparative data from other places now, and that, of course, leads to all sorts of other questions. Pork barrel politics is one.
Yeah.
I want to go back and do some work in political history, particularly in the immediate post-war, the issue of the ratification of the Constitution, some more mainline, what would be called straight arrow historical research in some documents, because that's fascinating too.
Well, pork barrel politics, you could have 3 more careers in studying Japan.
That's
Jack,
right.
thanks very much.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure to talk about Tanohata anytime.